But yeah, welcome to this Wild Night In session on Biodiversity Net Gain. Yeah, thanks for coming and for showing your interest in Biodiversity Net Gain. As I've been saying, just if you could just make sure your microphone's muted, that would be great. And it is being recorded, so and will appear on YouTube later. So if you don't want your face on YouTube, then maybe turn your camera off. But yeah, feel free to put where you're from and your interest in BNG in the chat. And we will be doing a Q&A and discussion once the presentation's over. So put any questions into the chat and we'll go through as many as we can at the end. So yes, welcome to this session on Biodiversity Net Gain, or BNG as we're referring to it. I'm Jihanna Bonilla-Allard, and I'm the BNG Development Officer working in the Wildscapes team at the Trust. As you're probably aware, BNG is a new and emerging approach to development and is a very technical and new area. So we hope this session will explain to you what it is and help you understand sort of the basics of BNG. So yeah, this session is being delivered by my colleague, Dr. Nicky Rivers. Nicky's the Advocacy and Development Manager here at the Sheffield and Rotherham Wildlife Trust and has worked for the Trust for 15 years, where she has gained sort of working knowledge of planning policy and advocacy alongside project development and supporting communities. And Nicky's been involved with BNG over the last few years, sort of working alongside her main role at the Trust. And she spent working with the Wildscapes team advising a neighbouring local planning authority on the quality of the BNG component for planning applications being submitted. And she's currently still part of the Trust and Wildscapes group looking at how we're taking BNG forward. So with that, yeah, welcome to the Trust, welcome to our talk on BNG, sorry, and I'll hand over to you, Nicky. I hope you enjoyed the session and find it useful.
Thank you so much for the introduction. And some of you may have come to the recent talk on the Sheffield local plan. And when we asked you in a poll whether you'd like a talk on BNG, and most of you said yes. So you'll know how to have a good time with your Wild Night In. That's 2 sessions on planning for the dedicated ones amongst you. We have a first question that my colleague Becca's going to pop it into the chat, a little poll for you to answer about BNG. Becca, if you put the first poll in the chat, if you've not used a poll before, you should have a little box coming up on your computer. It might not work if you're watching it from the comfort of your sofa on the TV, just about how much you already know about BNG. If your box doesn't pop up, it might be because your window pop-up thing is blocking it and you might have to allow it. If you don't answer, it doesn't matter. It's just really partly for our interest to sort of, know where people are coming from. So in answer to the first question that's coming up there, BNG is Biodiversity Net Gain, and the which just come up in the chat. And tonight I'm going to tell you what Biodiversity Net Gain is, and quite a few of you are new to the subject, which is totally understandable because it is new, and if you're not in the sort of technical field of ecology or planning policy, you probably don't know what it is. You might have heard it. Some people know a bit, some people know a bit more, so it's quite interesting actually. We'll save that poll, thanks for that. And hopefully share the results with you if you can see that. So 29 people out of 63 don't know that much or nothing. 18 of you know little, 12 of you know some, and a few people know a bit more and just want to hear a view, which is also fine. So the oops, I can close that. So we are Sheffield and Rotherham Wildlife Trust, so we will be, the talk will be general talk about Biodiversity Net Gain. There will be a bit of local focus, just say that because I know some of you are not local, which is fine, but just say there will be a little bit of local focus, but most of it will be relevant to everybody. And I'm just going to share my screen now. Becca, can you just tell me if you can see that? Okay.
Yeah, perfect, Nicky.
Excellent. Okay, so we're going to talk about biodiversity net gain, what it is, and will biodiversity really benefit? And I'm going to give a talk for about probably 45 minutes, and there'll be, or 40 minutes or so, and there'll be a chance to answer questions at the end. So as Jihanna said, do put them in the chat as you think of them, you go on, and then Jihanna can be compiling them ready to read out at the end. So don't save it all for the end if you're thinking while you go along. So I'm going to talk about why do we need biodiversity net gain, or BNG, as I'm going to shorten it to from now on, what it is, a bit about the legislation and policy, a bit about how it works in practice, and some of the benefits and good practice, and some of the sort of risk areas as well. So why do we need BNG? So in the UK and in England, nature is not doing as well as it should do. The UK is one of the most nature depleted countries in the world, and the State of Nature report shows that the abundance and distribution of species has, on average, declined over recent decades, and the decline continues. It's not all bad, but it's not all bad for all habitats for all species, but overall, we've lost a huge amount of wildlife since the 1970s and are continuing to do so. Even species like hedgehog used to be about 30 million in the 1950s, and today, and then about 1.5 million 1995, and now 500,000 2018. So even common species, particularly seen in urban areas as well as in the countryside. And even very recently, the government 25-year environment plan that they put out in 2018, a very new report, has shown that these plans are not succeeding, even in the last few years. The Office of Environmental Protection, which is a new body that's been set up by the government, sort of keep an eye on what the government's doing, assess 32 trends, and some were doing okay, some were the same, but some were deteriorating. That's and including one around the abundance of priority species, and that's in just the very recent years still declining. And they conclude that the natural environment remains under serious threat, and they're very concerned about that. So we need to do something about that. We need to halt the loss and then reverse the loss and decline and allow nature to recover. So what's going on? Why are we, losing wildlife biodiversity still? So there's a lot of different factors at play. One of the main ones is changes in agriculture management. We won't be particularly talking about that today. That's another subject, and there's a whole load of other drivers around woodland management, non-native species, fisheries, water management. But the drivers that are sort of most related to biodiversity net gain are urbanisation and pollution, which can be a spin-off from urbanisation, although you also get pollution from farming and other things as well. So it's about new roads, new houses, new areas for employment. They all collectively have an impact. So I'm afraid some of these slides will be quite technical. It's just the nature of the subject material. But for those of you who are interested in planning and development, there's a national planning policy framework, which is like national planning policy. That's the NPPF, National Planning Policy Framework. Already has a planning policy that talks about how both planning policies and decisions, that's decisions on whether planning application should go ahead or not, should contribute to and enhance the natural local environment. And if you look at D, it's about minimising impacts on and providing net gains for biodiversity, contributing to ecological networks. which is something that we all want. So you think, oh, okay, well, the policy is already there, but it can be, the net gain could be tiny, could be 0.01%, and you've achieved a net gain. It's not very much, and it's not very robust policy of sort of proving that people have done this. And we do at the minute use this policy to object to some planning applications where we think that the development has not provided a net gain for biodiversity, provided a loss. But it's not a super strong policy, that. And most people interpret that as being sort of no net loss of biodiversity. And there's another related policy, which is around avoiding, mitigating, compensating for biodiversity loss, which is the mitigation hierarchy, which I'm going to come back to. And it's saying that if this can't be demonstrated, it should be refused. And in some cases they are, but you know, other cases it's hard to know. And you might think, well, but there are other protections in place in the planning system for wildlife. Yes, we've got sites that are designated for nature conservation, some protected by law, some only offered some protection via planning policies, such as local wildlife sites, ones protected by laws, things like SSSIs. And there's some protection for certain species in the planning system, such as mainly European protected species like bats and great crested newts and dormice, and Schedule 1 species such as barn owls and things like that. And at the moment, the main way of assessing impact on ecology is through a process called the ecological impact assessment, which will look at all the habitats and any protected sites and species and make an assessment of impact. And they will follow the mitigation hierarchy. And this is where the ecologists, professional ecologists usually will look for, you know, any decent sized planning application. We'll look at whether significant harm to wildlife species and habitats can be avoided, for example, by locating an alternative site with less harmful impacts. And then they'll look at minimizing the impacts. Can the impacts be avoided or minimized, such as design on a site, or things like lighting or season, or how the impacts of the construction, for example. And then if there's any sort of impact, they'll assess all this in a report. And if they think there's any impact still remaining, and they tend to, this sort of assessment just look at significant impacts, not all impacts, then they might look at compensation. Although, you know, practice it doesn't happen a huge amount. And there's a lot of existing guidance for people involved in this sector, in ecology and development and planning. Loads of good practice guidance and standards and so on, which are used. And some development, you know, does well in this area, and some doesn't. It does vary a bit in our experience. But really, what we need to say is just, it's not about just minimizing and significant impact. It's about halting the loss of biodiversity as far as the planning system can, and about restoring biodiversity through nature recovery networks, bigger, better, more joined up nature recovery networks, to enhance that nature recovery, because we want 30% of the land to be great for nature by 2030. And how can planning development contribute to that? So what is BNG? So BNG is a new approach to development, and you can also use it in other ways of assessing land, which I'll mention at the end. But it's about leaving biodiversity in a measurably better state than before the development took place. So it has primarily been developed for use in the planning and development sector, primarily. And that measurably better is really important. And this, again, is looking at that sort of impact. So if you look at this graph, if you have a development, you can have a predicted impact in this pink column on that development. And then say you'll go through the mitigation hierarchy, say, can we avoid some of that or all of it? Can we minimize some? Can we mitigate some? And we might be left with a bit that needs to be compensated. And that gets to that no net loss. And the difference with biodiversity net gain is that then the developer has to add more, to enhance, to gain more than what was there before. And that's the new bit, one of the new bits. And here's another way of looking at it. You know, this is the no net loss. This is the net gain, the taller graph, in relation to the mitigation hierarchy, which you must follow first: avoidance, minimization, mitigation, and then offset last if required, and then this enhancement. So where's this come from? Well, it has been in development for quite a number of years. Originally some DEFRA offset pilots quite a few years now. Again, we're not really using the term offsetting anymore. We tend to using biodiversity net gain. And it's come to the point where the Environment Act that came in November 2021 introduced this new requirement that any basically Town and Country Planning Act development will be required to meet the objective that biodiversity value attributable to the development exceeds the pre-development biodiversity value of the on-site habitat by at least 10%. That's the legal wording. And since that came in, we've been in this transition period where it said that we had everybody involved in this sector had 2 years to work out how to do that. And we're still in that transition period. And from November 2023, that minimum 10% biodiversity net gain will be statutory, will be mandatory in the planning system, material planning consideration by those making decisions about planning applications. Local planning authorities are able to bring that forward at the time by writing local policies, and they're able to increase that minimum 10% if they want to. And from April, this has just come out last week, that minimum 10% will be mandatory for small sites, except if they contain priority habitats, for example. And NSIPs, which are nationally important infrastructure projects, such as big rail and road projects, will also be subject to this requirement, statutory requirement. They have a bit longer to get ready, which is a bit of a shame, but originally they weren't going to be included at all. And a lot of advocacy work by Wildlife Trust and other NGOs and people push for NSIPs to be included. You know, schemes such as HST, which has so far been just operating at trying to prove no net loss of biodiversity. We haven't even been doing very well at that, to be honest. But so it's really good that NSIPs will be included. And there will be exemptions. So if you're a householder wanting to convert your garage to a room, it's not relevant. Permitted developments aren't relevant, and really tiny little areas are not relevant to they'll be exempt, basically. So how does it work? So there will be a whole biodiversity net gain assessment as part of that ecological assessment. So I've talked about ecological impact assessment. That will still carry on, and there'll be biodiversity net gain sort of as part of that. And a professional ecologist, because it is quite technical actually, will look at the site and make an assessment on the biodiversity net gain and write a biodiversity net gain report. And as part of that, and this is really important, they will use a tool which is called a DEFRA metric, which looks currently like this. This is a screenshot, but it is a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet based tool. And it is a tool, it's a calculation tool, and it is quite clever because it's been developed over a number of years. This is iteration 3.1, and previous iterations have been tested widely by the sector, by consultants, by NGOs, by developers, everybody, and government agencies, and fed back, and it's improved over time. Natural England have developed a lot of it, but it's released by Biodiversity Natural England. And it is, and this is where it comes into the measurable bit. This is what has to be used to measure that biodiversity. And this tool is version 3.1. We're expecting the final version, which we think is going to be called 4.0 very soon. And then they'll probably stop updating it for a while. And the way this works is that you have an ecologist, a botanist usually, because this is a habitats-based tool, who will go out onto the potential development site with all the methodology that they've learnt, and they'll carry out a particular type of survey based on a survey technique called UK HAB, which is also quite new. I'll put a link for these things at the end. And they'll survey the site, and they'll map out the site in all the different habitats on the sites and subhabitats, and the condition of the habitats, and then they get back, and I'll show you in a minute an example. They'll map the habitats to get the areas of each habitat parcel, and then they'll put all this data into the on-site cell A1, which is on-site habitat baseline, or B1 if it's hedgerow, or C1 it's a river, and that's a different methodology for rivers, which is quite bespoke. And then they'll look at the plans or potential plans for the sites. If, say, for example, it's a housing site, they'll look at what habitats are to be retained, what might be enhanced, what might be created, and what might be lost on the site. And then the tool will work out the sums about whether that will result in a biodiversity net loss or gain. And just go on screen. So it's looking at the size of the habitat, or the length if it's a hedgerow or river, the quality, the type of habitat, so that's called its distinctiveness, which is set by Natural England. So for example, you know, a broadleaf woodland is a higher distinctiveness than a sports pitch. And then by the condition, and that's something that's assessed by the ecologist in the field. And for some reason it's missing off this DEFRA slide, is the strategic significance. That's the location of where it is, like, is it part of an ecological network, or for example. And that the metric will give you then the number of biodiversity units for that parcel. We'll do that for all the parcels and add them up. So here's an example of the map. So it is quite technical. Each bit of land, this is Althorpe Fields, for example, has it's split into parcels, and they've all got these special codes for the UK HAB, and then they have to be mapped on GIS software that works out the areas for you. And then you can also need to look at, so I'll come back to that one, condition. Here's an example of woodland condition assessment. So this is just some of the 13 things that the ecologist has got to consider when they're looking at woodland. They need to look at, so green, if it's green for each one, you get 3 points. If it's amber, 2 points. If it's red, you get 1 point. And they need to look at every line and to work out what condition that woodland is in. And then you get points, and then they're added up. And that will give you overall good, moderate, or poor. You put all that in, and you get something along the lines of this. So the green are the habitats. So it will tell you how much. This is an example. Don't think it matches the map, by the way. It's just another example. Modified grasslands, which is a low distinctive habitat. It's in poor condition, but it's quite a big area, so you get 5.2 units. And then there's other type of grasslands, which is higher distinctiveness, poor condition, and so on. And you've got, you know, some woodland there, moderate condition, and you get all the number of units on the baseline. And then the same with the hedgerows, how long they are, what condition they're in, where they are, and you get hedgerow units. And if there's rivers, the same again. And then you've got to look at whether you can basically reach that 10% minimum gain on site through habitat creation or enhancement of existing habitats through, for example, really good high quality green infrastructure or green routes, or leaving. The best thing to do is to leave the best bits of habitat alone if you can, and avoid chopping them down or digging them up, because the more you take away, the more you've got to get back, and then add on 10%. So that's where the avoidance piece comes in the mitigation hierarchy. And if you can't get to that 10% on site, you're then looking at, okay, we need to get to that by delivering that compensation off site somewhere. And that involves finding a suitable site to deliver suitable habitats, ideally in the local area. And if you can't do that, then there's going to be a sort of backstop where the government is going to be able to sell statutory credits. So the developer have to buy some statutory credits for national schemes. That hasn't been set up yet. It's in the process of being set up, so don't know how much that costs or anything. That should be the most expensive option, so the others are preferable. And if a developer has to buy any offsite units, it's going to cost them money, quite a bit of money. So they've got to try and, it's an incentive to minimise damage. The sort of results page you might get looks a bit like this. Headline results, there's a load of detailed results as well, but in this case it's showing that the development is starts off with 1.3 units of hedgerow and is ending up with 2.48 metres of hedgerow. Hedgerow is relatively easy to put more hedgerow in, say it's a housing scheme. So they've ended up with a 35% net gain of hedgerow. That's good news. Whereas in the habitats, they start with 11.77, and they've managed to get 12.58. So they've done quite well. They've actually got more than they started with, but not 10%. So they need, not quite, they need to get a bit more offsite, a little bit of units. They've enhanced some units offsite from 2.4 to 8.94, and that's given them that gain they need. They've actually ended up with 62%. So that's sort of satisfying the biodiversity net gain requirement. And trading rules, that's about making sure that if you're losing woodland, you are gaining woodland. If you're losing grassland, you're gaining grassland, for example, unless there's good reason not to. So it's really important that biodiversity net gain is done well. And there's a lot of good practice guidance is being published. This one's back from 2016, so it has been in development for a while. And it's about things like applying that mitigation hierarchy first, avoiding losing biodiversity that cannot be offset by gains elsewhere. And, you know, all these other good practice principles. It's really important that these are done, especially that last one about being transparent, so people can follow and they know it's not sort of being used as a sort of shortcut or anything. There's also some sort of principles and rules around how the metric's used. It is just a tool that informs decision making. You know, ecological expertise and judgment does come into it, and it doesn't override things like existing protection for biodiversity. And you know, there might be other things that need to be thought about from an ecological point of view. Oh, slides got stuck. There we go. You know, this number 8 is a bit about, you might have, it's not just about area, it's about units. So you might have quite a large area of poor habitat, quality habitat, poor, low distinctiveness, ample quality, but you might have a smaller area of high distinctiveness, better condition habitat to compensate. But overall, you should think about not losing too much area as well, and avoid trading down. So it's not about losing great habitat and putting in something that's not as good. So there is quite a lot of good practice out there. So there's really no excuse for people involved in biodiversity net gain not to follow these good practice. the Chartered Institute of Ecological and Environmental Managers, which I'm a full member of, done loads of training, and they've got reports and audit templates. And for planners, the Planning Advisory Service put loads of training on. They've done absolute masses, actually. Natural England, they're getting stuff out there all the time. To BSI, there's lots, you know, there's more coming all the time. So it's ensuring that these things are done well. So if biodiversity is done well, net gain is done well in the planning system, there should be more consistency and less ambiguity for developers, planning authorities and communities. Biodiversity should be thought about earlier, and because there's a financial consideration, you know, now if a developer wants to chop down a really great woodland, for example, it's going to cost them so more than it would have done before. So it's making developers stop and think a bit more about where to put development and how to arrange a site and so on, which is good. Biodiversity is thought about earlier, not as an add-on, and also join up with the landscaping, making sure that, for example, native habitats come into green infrastructure where possible, things like that. And the other really good thing about this legislation about BNG is that it involves a legal 30-year minimum management of the biodiversity net gain land, and that is for on-site and off-site, and that includes management and monitoring, and that's way more than the current system. Now, if you have a planning application, you might be required to manage the habitats on land for 5 years, and minimum in the way of monitoring that or reporting on that. So this is a huge change. I mean, we can't be sure for now what's going to happen after 30 years, and it depends on the landowner and the manager. So if for example, you have an off-site biodiversity compensation site that's looked after by a reputable landowner or land manager, NGO, for example, or someone that you know that's got a good reputation, you know, it might be looked after well for in perpetuity. But that 30 years, basically the cost units will cover the cost of that funding and management for 30 years, which is why they're expensive. It's expensive, but it needs to be, because it needs to pay for that 30 years. And there will be incentives for any off-site and on-site to contribute towards nature recovery networks and local nature recovery strategies that are coming out, and that should mean more nature in towns and countryside. There are risk areas, of course. It is not a license to trash and move all the biodiversity elsewhere off-site. Certain things are not included, such as irreplaceable habitats and, you know, triplet size. You can't just, you know, you can't just develop anywhere because you can compensate elsewhere. There's also a really good requirement in the Environment Act about not clearing a site before the baseline is carried out. And if a developer does that, they'll effectively be penalised because the baseline will be taken from, I think it's 2020, 2021, I can't remember. And there'll be an assumption of the condition of the habitats, which are probably higher than what it actually was. So it's not a good idea for a developer or landowner to clear a site before baseline. It will backfire. And development, the biodiversity net gain is not restricted to within the red line of a planning boundary, because, as I said, some could be off-site. It may be a developer owns another bit of land that could be used for net gain. It could be that somebody else owns a bit of land and they buy units. There's different mechanisms for doing that. It's not a substitute for other obligations. It's not to do with green belt. It's nothing to do with agricultural land, nothing to do with landscapes. So biodiversity net gain could be delivered off-site, could be delivered on agricultural land or green belt, for example, to make them more biodiverse. There are risk areas about people not abiding by the trading rules and principles. Some of this will come down to local planning authorities having the staff and the skilled staff to check applications thoroughly and turn any away that aren't good enough. This is the work we were helping a neighbouring local authority with quite a while, and you know, the application, many that weren't very good, but I think because it's new, everyone's getting better at it all the time, everyone involved in this area of work, and other people commenting as well, not just local authorities. And local authorities need funding to do this, and governments just promise them a bit more funding because they're all short-staffed to look at these, you know, give expert opinion and views on these applications that come in. And it is a habitats-based assessment requiring technical understanding by the applicants and the assessors on the sort of habitats and the quality of habitats and surveys, and that's, you know, it's not easy stuff, this. And you can't conflate the habitats, so you end up with 3 numbers: one for habitats, one for hedgerows, one for rivers. Even if one of them is 0, you mustn't squash them all together because they're measured differently. And it's not about a numbers game. So the full metrics need to be submitted so this can be scrutinised, and the BNG should be a part of a whole ecological assessment. As I say, the metric is a tool, but looked at in the round as part of the ecological assessment. So that's really important to remember, not about sidestepping the mitigation hierarchy, for example. And the metric doesn't specifically include species. Consideration should be given to locally relevant species interests when creating or enhancing new habitats, of course, because species need habitats in the main. And there tend to be more addressed existing policy and legislation, and there could be, you know, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't still be asking for bat bricks and swift boxes and you know, swift bricks or all these other species enhancements. We still be asking for those things as well. Risk areas around local policies and procedures and pricing for units needs to be robust. So the pricing, for example, needs to cover the 30 years management as a minimum. And being realistic around habitat enhancement or creation, particularly on a development site. So, for example, if you're putting in some green infrastructure in the middle of a housing estate, you can't say, well, we're going to create a really high distinctness, good condition meadow, because it'll be walked all over by people and dogs, and it just won't be that standard. So you don't want to put in something that you think you can achieve that's unrealistic. And same with offsite as well. The monitoring, management, quality assessment has to be really good. And then is this 10% going to be enough for nature recovery? There is some work that suggests that really, because of sort of indirect effects of development, that 10% is more like a contingency for those indirect effects, and it may just result in no net loss. And that, you know, wildlife trusts naturally are asking for 20%, but it's, you know, the reality is it's actually quite difficult to even get to 10% in many cases, particularly for many reasons, viability, finding land, etc. So yeah, ideally we'd want more. This is certainly a starting point, and some sites, some developments will achieve more. It's a case by case basis. Local planning authorities at the moment are in this sort of transition zone. They're supposed to be getting everything ready. It's quite tricky because a lot of things are happening at the same time, like local nature recovery strategies and starting to be written and things, and they should have, you know, there's a lot to get in place, and the government hasn't even yet released all its guidance. There's more coming, which I'll come on to in a minute. So locally here in Sheffield and Rotherham Council consulted on a draft policy document, which is called the Supplementary Planning Document, SPD, in the autumn, but they haven't submitted, you know, published anything yet. They might be waiting for the new guidance coming out. Sheffield Council included a BNG policy in their draft local plan, which was recently out to consultation, which we covered in the last Wild Night In. And they plan to follow up with a SPD, which provides that detailed guidance for developers and consultants and public. Peak District National Park Authority, early stages of new local plans, so they'll be including something. There's less development, of course, in the national park, just by its nature. but we comment on all these things and say there's related strategies are forthcoming as well. And the government, although they expect it all to be ready to go in November, they haven't published all the guidance yet, which is a little bit frustrating for everyone. The final metrics should be due out soon. They still haven't published the secondary legislation, which is about more details on irreplaceable habitats and all that sort of thing. They just last week published a sort of consultation response, which kind of said what they're going to publish next. And then there'll be guidance for local planning authorities. What about phased developments, a bit more on small sites? What's the mechanism? Will it be through Section 106 agreements? Is it through conservation covenants? You know, all these sort of nuts and bolts about where's the money go, what the league agreements, and, you know, all that sort of tricky stuff. And then looking at sort of templates for reports and plans. So, you know, there's a lot to take in because it is a big new technical subject that's fast changing, fast paced. And as a sector, I think everybody's learning together and quite good at helping each other. There's things like a BNG Facebook group if you want to, you know, get stuck in and talk to other people. If you're interested, I'll put some links up in a minute. You can read about Biodiversity Net Gain. If you're young and keen, or not young, maybe you're older and keen, but I mean, you want to be working in the sector and you're not, there's a shortage of really skilled botanists. You could get yourself skilled up, and UK have, and probably be snapped up for a job. You can look at the metric and go on training courses, train yourself up as well. And maybe you're a landowner who might be interested in using this as a way of paying for enhancing your land for biodiversity. What about, you could ask your council who'd be assessing the technical submissions. Do they have an ecologist? Are they going to get maps and raw spreadsheets available to the public so you can look at them? Or talk to your, you know, wildlife trusts or other environmental NGOs about what they're doing if you're not in this area. And do, you know, get yourself skilled if you're interested in stuff. If you're not, that's absolutely fine. But I know some of you are interested and love responding to planning consultations, and you don't have to be, you know, a botanist. You could still probably work out the following best practice. There's a lot of information out there. I don't expect you to scribble this down because we will be sending you the link to the recording afterwards, so you can take your time and look afterwards. But there's plenty of information out there. So, and if you want to, if you're local and you want to ask me or my colleague Ian a question about it, you can contact us. And then I'm just going to pass you back to Jihanna to just say a few words about the work that she's doing. And then we'll take some questions. So I'm just going to say thank you for now. I'm going to just close this presentation and pass to Jihanna.
Yeah, thank you, Nicky, for that. Really useful and interesting. So yeah, as previously mentioned, I'm the Biodiversity Net Gain Development Officer. I work with colleagues both in the Trust and our Wildscapes team. And we're looking into how we can offer professional ecological advice to developers who are needing to get involved in BNG and wanting to know more, but also to landowners around BNG opportunities for them and how they can get involved. But we're also looking at how the Trust and Wildscapes can get involved in potentially delivering offsite BNG and contributing to nature recovery and making sure that BNG is done to a high standard and to following best practice. So yeah, if you want to discuss any opportunities with me, if you're a developer, a landowner, or any just interested in learning more, then please feel free to reach out and contact me. So yeah, as for questions, a few have come through from the chat, but feel free to add any more if you have any. So we've had a few about sort of the metric and how that works. So first there was one that came through about, I think it was in reference to the metric calculating the habitat extent. So does the area include consideration for slope, and how that kind of works?
That's a good question. No, specifically, except that when the ecologist is looking at the condition of the habitat, this, you know, the impact of the slope on the condition might come into play, I'd say, but also that might come into the broader ecological impact assessment if it's relevant. So perhaps if you're wanting to create habitat for butterflies on the sunny slope, or for example, you might choose to do that if that's possible on the site, or you might lose a habitat for the butterflies if you're losing that slope. I think that'll come into the broader assessment.
And we